Now, as Jennifer mentioned just a few moments ago, tonight's expert, Christopher Lane, is the owner of the Philadelphia Print Map Shop West, purveyor and appraiser of antique prints, maps, and related books. In 1982, Mr. Lane founded the Philadelphia Print Shop with Donald H. Creswell and later opened a branch in Denver. The Denver shop is now its own new business, following the tradition of the original shop, through with more of an emphasis on Western Americana. Mr. Lane has given lectures around the country on various topics, including natural history prints, Currier and Ives prints, and most recently on maps and views of the American West. Mr. Lane has curated print and map exhibits and has authored numerous articles and books, including Panorama of Pittsburgh, the winner of the Ewell L. Newman Award. Chris is a long-standing board member of the Rocky Mountain Map Society. Beginning in 1997, Chris has appeared as a regular print and map appraiser for the public television show Antiques Roadshow. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Christopher Lane.
Thank you very much. Now, this lecture is about prints and maps showing images of what is today Colorado. From the first printed view, published in 1822, to Ralph Carlisle Prather's wonderful panorama of the Rocky Mountain National Park, issued a century later. Old prints and maps are attractive and fun to look at for the images they provide us of our past, but they are also quite important as historical documents. Not only are the images intrinsically interesting, but they provide unique information not available from other sources. Before the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, essentially the only images that existed of what is today Colorado were small prints which appeared in various government reports. With the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the United States gained a large amount of land about which little was known. The U.S. government was eager to learn about this region, so right from the Louisiana Purchase and continuing until late in the 19th century, numerous government expeditions were sent out to learn about the region. Luckily for us, these expeditions were tasked with documenting in both word and picture what was found, and this resulted in a whole series of government reports which included the earliest prints of Colorado. The first printed view of Colorado appeared in the report of a government expedition from 1819 to 1820, led by Stephen Long. Long marched up the Platte River from the Missouri, down the south branch of the Platte to the Rocky Mountains, and then probed along the Spanish border to the south. Samuel Seymour was the expedition artist, and he was one of the first trained artists to make drawings of any part of the American West. This print is the first depiction of the Rocky Mountains based on first-hand drawing. It is a view of the Rockies from approximately where Greeley is today, looking toward Boulder. It was over 2 decades before another government expedition came into today's Colorado. In 1842, Captain John C. Fremont was sent to explore what became known as the Oregon Trail. And the following year, he led a second expedition to the west. On both of those expeditions, Fremont passed through Colorado. The report of his expedition included this lithograph of Pikes Peak. This view shows the mountain from a vantage point just north of where Denver is located today, a spot where Fremont camped on July 11, 1842. Now, it says it's 40 miles distance. The distance is actually about twice of that. They didn't really have a grasp of how big these mountains were at the time. Part of the impetus of Fremont's exploration was a search for a route for a transcontinental railroad. In 1853, Congress appropriated $150,000 to the Army's Topographical Bureau to undertake a number of surveys to find the most practical route for a proposed railroad. Between 1855 and 1861, the government issued 12 volumes reports from these surveys, which included hundreds of prints showing scenes of the American West. They were based on first-hand drawings by trained artists, and these prints provide us an invaluable resource of the West in the pre-Civil War period. The formidable nature of the Colorado Mountains meant that not many of the surveys actually passed through Colorado. They tended to go north or south. But one expedition did pass through our state. It was led by Captain John W. Gunnison. And this survey party left Westport, Kansas in June 1853, ascended the Arkansas River, and then using several passes in today's southern Colorado, made it through to the Great Basin. Unfortunately, a skirmish in the mountains with Ute Indians led to the deaths of Gunnison, the expedition artist Richard H. Kern, and 7 others. Luckily, Kern's sketches were saved and were later prepared for publication by John Mix Stanley. These include the views shown here, 2 of the Sangre de Cristo Pass and 1 of Fort Massachusetts, the first military post in what would become Colorado. The next government survey which passed through Colorado was led by Captain John N. Macomb. He left Santa Fe in 1859 in an attempt to find a practical route from there to Utah. He was accompanied by geologist and botanist John S. Newberry, who had previously participated in a number of other government expeditions in the West. Because of the Civil War, though, publication of his report, which was included by the lovely prints by Newberry, was delayed until 1876. Back in 1867, the U.S. government took a more systematic approach to gathering information on the American West. That year, the U.S. Geological and Geographical Survey of the Territories was created, leading to an ongoing series of scientific expeditions to study the West. One of the main leaders of these expeditions was Dr. Ferdinand V. Hayden. Hayden participated in a number of survey parties around the West, but in 1873 decided that he would focus on Colorado, extensively surveying the territory between 1873 and 1876. And producing a number of reports. These publications included maps as well as many views of Colorado. Some of them, like this collage, were based on photographs. Now, the photographs themselves were not widely disseminated. They weren't printed in very large numbers. But by being turned into wood engravings and issued in the government reports, their information was made available to a much wider audience. In 1867, Clarence King, who had previously worked on the surveys in California, was appointed to head the U.S. Geological Survey along the 40th parallel. King conducted the survey extending from California to Colorado and Wyoming from 1867 to 78. In 1869 and 70, he was accompanied by artist Gilbert Munger, who King complimented by saying he, quote, made and finished studies of what I saw, painting the geological formations with careful detail so that a geologist could tell the species of rock. Now, this image by Munger shows the Green River where it passes through Colorado. And it's interesting to note that because the coloring was so important to the information being presented, the print was made using chromolithography, where the color was applied in the printing process rather than by hand, which a lot of the previous prints were done. The views issued in the U.S. government reports were the earliest of Colorado and some of the most interesting of the 19th century. These views were not tied in to any particular event, but were intended as timeless scientific documents of the physical character of the American West. Another group of 19th century views of Colorado were much more event-oriented. These were views published not by the government, but by the popular press. The advent of wood engraving allowed the popular press to produce a large body of prints which illustrated an amazing variety of topics. In 1858, gold was discovered at the conjunction of the South Platte and Cherry Creek in the western part of Kansas Territory. This led to the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, in which thousands of prospectors and those intending to make money off of them flooded across the plains to the foothills of the Rockies. Now, this was big news for the American public, and it created a demand for realistic images of what would soon become Colorado. This demand was met by a wonderful series of prints issued by the popular press, especially in the illustrated newspapers of the day. These newspapers included illustrations on almost any subject which might be of interest to the American public, and they were published within mere weeks of the events shown, usually based on first-hand sketches. The newspaper publishers were always looking for breaking news to report on, so when the Pikes Peak Gold Rush happened, almost immediately, the 2 leading American newspapers, Frank Leslie's Illustrated News and Harper's Weekly, sent out reporters and artists to document it for their readers. In August 1859, Leslie issued a 3-page spread which included the very first printed views of Denver. 2 of the views are of communities which then made up Denver. The image on the top right shows Denver City looking to the southwest, and the image below that is of Auraria looking west toward the Platte River. Now, it's interesting to note that the cabins are lined up in rows following a surveyed grid plan, even though the streets are fairly rudimentary, as is shown in the image on the left. Besides newspaper illustrations, the popular press also issued a series of guidebooks intended for potential Pikes Peakers, or those just interested in the exciting events taking place in the far west. These guides often included wood-engraved illustrations, which, though quite small and not nearly as timely as the newspaper prints, were usually based on first-hand drawings. This view of Golden is a typical guidebook illustration from a work by Dr. Charles Clark entitled A Trip to Pikes Peak. Clark was a Chicago physician who was an unsuccessful participant in the Pikes Peak Gold Rush of 1860, but who had more success with an account of his experience, which he published the following year. His guide contained numerous illustrations about which the author wrote, quote, "The sketches illustrating the work are true to nature and are as perfect as a limited experience in the art could make them." Here is another guidebook illustration, this one showing Denver and Auraria in 1860, when these communities had about 3,000 permanent residents and 400 buildings. This view was clearly drawn based on a first-hand observation. Auraria was then the larger community, and it is shown on the left across Cherry Creek. Denver on the near side is shown on slightly higher ground. Though usually based on first-hand drawings, not all the illustrated newspaper prints were totally accurate, as we can see if we examine this newspaper print from December 1860, the first large-scale view of Denver. On the print, it is stated to have been based on a sketch by Colonel D.H. Hewitt, quote, "made expressly for Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper." However, if we compare it to the guidebook illustration we just looked at, which was produced earlier in the year, they are clearly based on the same drawing. You can see how they show essentially the same building and even the same two teepees below the large tree. However, the engraver of the Leslie print made some modifications to the image which make the print erroneous in a few details. First, the higher ground upon which Denver City sits is far too elevated and steeply banked. The guidebook illustration is somewhat crudely carved, but still the slope up to the buildings on the Denver side can be interpreted as fairly gradual, as is the case in reality. The slope in the newspaper print is almost a cliff, which is just incorrect. An even more drastic error is that Cherry Creek, shown flowing between the tree and bush-lined banks on the book illustration, is depicted as a road on the Leslie's print. The engraver of this print apparently interpreted Hewitt's drawing of the creek as a road, which he widened and even put a small pedestrian walking along it. While these newspaper prints do give us a contemporary look at the past, it is not always a completely accurate one. Even as the excitement of the gold rush passed, the American public remained fascinated by the American West. So the illustrated newspapers continued to send out artists to document it. In 1873, Harper's Weekly commissioned two young French artists, Paul Franzeni and Jules Tavernier, to cover the Trans-Mississippi West. And from that and subsequent trips, they provided Harper's with many images of life in Colorado. This view is a typical example showing miners crossing a pass in the Rockies, and about which the paper wrote, quote, "Our artists traveled for several days with such a party, and the picture they give us is an actual transcript of an actual scene." Besides daily life, the illustrated newspapers documented the buildings and cities in Colorado, with some images, such as the two on the left, being based on photographs. Photographs, which began to appear in the early Gold Rush era, are, of course, accurate and fascinating, but prints have several characteristics which makes them independently important as visual documentation of Colorado. First, they were much more widely disseminated than photographs. Though stereo views increased how many photographs were available to the general public, their number paled compared to, for instance, the over 100,000 papers published with each issue of Harper's Weekly. The visual image most Americans had of Colorado in the 19th century came from the prints in the illustrated newspapers as much, if not more, than from any other source. The other thing about prints compared to photographs was that they could capture events in motion, something that photographs could not do except in a stage setting. The artists sent out to document Colorado for the newspapers were able to capture in print any scene or event or whatever they thought would be of interest to the readers. For instance, this print shows a scene in Leadville of, quote, miners and immigrants enjoying a sawdust sleep in a billiard saloon at 2 bits a night. Today, a photograph could easily capture an image like this, but in the 19th century, it was only illustrated newspaper prints that could do this. Now, newspapers and the prints they contained were produced with the expectation that most copies would be discarded when the next weekly issue came out. In contrast, by the middle of the 19th century, other printed views and maps began to appear which were designed to be more prominent and a lasting role. These were commercial prints, issued either as separate prints or in portfolios of prints to be sold directly to the public. These were generally of better quality and larger size, intended to serve a practical purpose, which could include providing information, enhancing prestige, promoting businesses, or just as decoration for framing and display in the home or workplace. In order to help pay for the production of these commercial prints, as well as to ensure a reasonable number would be sold, the prints were usually sold by subscription. When a map or view of a particular locality was planned, sample drawings would be displayed to the public and the local newspapers would be enlisted to help promote the proposed publication. If enough subscriptions were sold, then the printmaker had at least a reasonable start to making a profit. Colorado had its share of commercial prints. During the early days of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, there were many people looking to make money, not only by mining, but by selling goods and services to the miners or by establishing mills and other businesses related to mining. This created a demand for topographical and geological information in the mining regions, and thus it is not surprising some of the earliest commercial prints of Colorado were maps. One of the rarest and earliest examples of this is a map of the, quote, Rocky Mountain gold regions, produced by E.W. Sinclair of Denver in 1861. This map shows the Front Range from Longs Peak to New Mexico, with details on the settlements, roads, and mining sites. 5 inset maps focus more closely on major mining areas. This map illustrates another way in which commercial printmakers made money, that is, by selling advertising images on their publication. The map includes 4 straightforward advertisements for businesses, including Jones and Cartwright's Pike Peak Transportation Line, Charles Schober, the lithographer of the map, and the breweries of J.J. Sands. Now, it's interesting to note that the 2 J.J. Sands breweries that are advertised were located in Chicago and Milwaukee, not exactly where a resident of Colorado would get his beer. Now, what this illustrates, which I think is really quite interesting and unusual, is that the map was aimed as much for a Midwestern audience as it was for a Denver audience, that these were not just for people here to give them information, they were to promote the area to potential mill owners or investors back in the Midwest. This map also includes, here we go, an early view of Denver. Views were often included on maps to help give an idea of the terrain of the area depicted, and that is part of the purpose of this image. However, this is also an advertisement for a book. The title says that it was presented by C.M. Clark, M.D., author of an interesting work entitled A Trip to Pikes Peak. Now, that book is the same one we discussed earlier when we saw Clark's wood engraving of Golden. Clark's guide included an illustration of Denver, and it's interesting to compare that view with the one on the map. There are enough similarities in perspective and detail that both of these images likely came from the same original drawing. On the map, the view is quite detailed with lots of interesting features, whereas the book illustration is much simpler. This is likely, however, just because the illustrations of the book had to be smaller and were made using a cruder printmaking process. Now, about the same time as Sinclair was working on his map of the Rocky Mountain gold regions, a similar map was being planned by John J. Pratt and Bella S. Buell. In December 1860, a local newspaper reported, and remember the map we just looked at was 1861, okay? But in December 1860, a local newspaper reported that Pratt and Buell were making surveys in the mining region, quote, for a large and elaborate map which they expect to have in circulation in early March. Now, interestingly, that newspaper notice indicated that, like the Sinclair map, this map would not be marketed only in Colorado, but also back east, stating, quote, the map will show our eastern friends at a glance our inexhaustible mining advantage and the rapid progress of our enterprising mill owners. Now, the map did not appear in March 1861. In fact, it didn't appear until August 1862, over a year and a half later. But when it was published, it was a magnificent large map showing topography, towns, mills, and the location of loads and other information of related interest. It included an inset map of the Colorado Territory by F.J. Ebert and 27 illustrations around the side. 20 of these images are of buildings in Colorado. Most of those, if not all, are based on photographs. Though not strictly advertisements, these illustrations were paid for by the building owners as promotion for their businesses or perhaps simply for prestige. Now, the publishers were always looking for other ways to make money. So as stated in a newspaper article, the border illustrations were also printed on separate sheets and for sale in that style. The prints then were sold as individual prints for local consumption, but that article notes also that, quote, no more acceptable presents could be sent to friends in the East by residents in Colorado than these views. So again, there's a theme that a lot of this material that's being made of Colorado is ending up back east. Now, besides the 20 building vignettes, there are 7 views of scenes of Colorado. Now, these were intended, again, in part to help give an idea of the terrain of the territory, but they were also for sale as separate prints. 3 of the images are unattributed, but 4 are attributed to specific artists. The view of Bear Creek gives the name of the artist as F.M. Case. That is Francis M. Case, the first Surveyor General of Colorado. He also went on to later be mayor of Denver. Now, as part of his survey work, Case would have had to have been able to make drawings to accompany his reports. His image of Bear Creek is of reasonable quality, though not of great artistic merit. Now, that matches the quality of the 3 unattributed views on the map, which leads me to think they may also have been drawn by Case, although his name does not appear on them. The last 3 views of Colorado are attributed to J.E. Dillingham, and they are of better artistic quality than the other 4. They were drawn by a Connecticut-born accountant named John E. Dillingham. Dillingham moved to Chicago about 1852, where he was listed for a number of years as an artist, and 2 of his sketches of Chicago appear in the Chicago Magazine of 1857. By 1861, Dillingham had moved to Denver, where he tried his hand at painting local scenes. He may have come in with the intent of making sketches for Eastern newspapers or magazines, though none seem to have been published. Dillingham did travel around the Front Range trying to sell his drawings of local scenes. At some stage, Dillingham hooked up with Pratt & Buell and had his images included on their map. Now, Dillingham's images were also listed as being sold individually. The view of Denver, the bottom one, is a particularly interesting print of which only 2 copies are known to exist. One is at the Denver Public Library. Now, the fluid nature of the illustrations on map by Pratt and Buell's is illustrated by a variant copy of the map, the example of which, the only known one, is in the CU map library and is on display. Well, there's actually a facsimile, but it's a really good facsimile on display, and they do have that map here. It's the only known variant copy of this map. Now, the copy is very close to the first one, with the major difference being that the top 2 illustrations in the top left corner are replaced by an image drawn by Dillingham of Bobtail Hill up in Gregory's Gulch. There had to be some reason for this change to be made, and it likely was a commercial one. I mean, all these things were done for commercial purposes, so if there was a change, there was some commercial reason behind it. Now, it's possible that the owners of the mills depicted here wanted to have their mills shown on the map and so paid for it. It's also possible that Dillingham wanted to advertise his new print, and this print was sold separately, and so maybe he's the one who had it added to this variant. Now, about the time that Dillingham was working on that, Bobtail Gulch, he was also working on another view of the same area, one which was never intended for a map illustration, but rather specifically to be sold as a separate print. This was a large view of Black Hawk, and it's about 2 feet by 3 feet in size, which was produced in January 1863. By March 12, 1863, a local paper was advertising this print as being sold by subscription, and the next month Dillingham announced he was heading back east to try to find additional subscribers there. Now, The print shows Black Hawk as a booming community with many prosperous, well-dressed citizens shown peacefully congregating around the town, including one woman on a horse and another woman and child pair. And that's an interesting feature. They're trying to show that this is not a frontier town. There are women there with children. Note that many businesses have their names displayed on their buildings. This is a way in which Dillingham can make some money on his print besides simply selling subscriptions. Dillingham would offer to display a business's name for a fee, and if you didn't pay the fee, you didn't get your name in the print. Now, this is not the only supplemental way in which Dillingham was able to get money for this particular print, as is detailed in an interesting story recorded in a recent resolution from the city of Black Hawk. On 1862, the Pratt and Buell map of the gold regions had the name of a small community just east of Central City listed as Enterprise. Supposedly, 3 local mill owners, William Lee, the proprietor of the Black Hawk Mill, Frederick Judge, owner of the Eagle Mill, and Milo Lee, who owned the Tiger Mill, all wanted the town to be named Black Hawk Point. So they are said to have commissioned Dillingham to produce this print with their preferred name prominently in the title. Now, this story is confirmed by the crest at the bottom, which has symbols representing their 3 mills, the Eagle, the Black Hawk, and the Tiger. Now, despite all the ways he tried to make money from his drawings, by having them used as map illustrations, marketing the prints by subscription, selling name rights, and getting commissions, ultimately Dillingham does not appear to have been successful. The last we definitely hear of him in Colorado is in April 1863, when he announced he would be heading back, quote, for a short trip east in order to sell subscriptions. He turns up again in Chicago directories, but there's no more record of him after 1863 in Colorado. Now, despite Dillingham's apparent lack of success, soon after he left Colorado, another Eastern artist arrived in Denver, intending much the same sort of career as that originally envisioned by Dillingham. This was Alfred Edward Matthews, who grew up in Ohio, had a varied career as a typesetter, itinerant bookseller, and schoolteacher, though with a predilection for landscape sketching. Matthews served with the Ohio troops in the Civil War, and a number of prints were made based on his drawings from that experience. After the war, Matthews set off for the West, intending to establish a career making and selling prints. After producing 4 drawings, which were turned into lithographs in Nebraska City in 1865, Matthews moved on to December and November of that year. The Rocky Mountain News reported his arrival on November 13th. Quote, "We received a call this morning from Mr. A.E. Matthews, an artist, typo, and soldier, who arrived here yesterday with the purpose of making sketches of scenery in town and country to be lithographed and furnished to subscribers." Less than a month later, Matthews was advertising in the Daily Miners Register of Central City that he, quote, "will receive subscription from millmen, miners, and others for views of mining and other localities of interest to subscribers." By the spring of 1866, 4 prints of Denver had been produced. These included a panoramic view of the city and 3 street scenes, such as this lively view of Larimer Street looking northeast between E, which was 14th, and F, 15th. Note the misspelling of the street name. This is the result of the lithographer who made the print in New York not being familiar with the name Larimer, and it was probably scribbled out and he said, "Oh, it's Laramie." Note also how Matthews did the same thing Dillingham did with his view of Black Hawk, selling space on the print for the names of businesses. You can see many of the shops have the name of the businesses prominently displayed, but there are also empty spots on some buildings indicating the owners of those stores didn't pay. Now, I've done a comparison of the business names on here there's a city directory from the same year, 1866, and they are all in the correct location, with one exception. On the very right of the print are shown 2 jewelry stores which appear to be next door to each other. However, there was only one jewelry store in that location, for Brunswick and Lauer's Jewelry Manufactory was not in fact located on Larimer Street, but instead was on F Street between Holiday and Larimer. Now, it seems that Brunswick and Lauer wanted to appear in one of Matthews' prints, but since Matthews wasn't going to do a print of F Street between Holiday and Larimer, they paid to have their name on a building around the corner. I hope they got a reduced rate. Within a few weeks, 4 more lithographs of Colorado arrived from New York. These were of communities outside Denver, including Black Hawk, Nevada, Central City, and a landscape entitled Snowy Range of the Rocky Mountains. Those 8 views were all sold as separate prints, but Matthews was even more ambitious, for he produced 15 more views of Colorado and gathered them into a portfolio entitled Pencil Sketches of Colorado, which he sold for $30. And there's a copy of that out in the exhibit. The scarcity of that portfolio today seems to indicate it didn't sell that well, but Matthews went on to produce 3 more similar portfolios, 2 of which, Gems of the Rocky Mountain Scenery and Canyon City, Colorado and its surroundings, included other views of Colorado. Now, the maps and views of Colorado we just looked at were created for commercial purposes, where accuracy, information conveyed, and promotional effectiveness were the primary focus, not really aesthetics. The view and map makers did want their prints to be attractive, but that was not the main object. There were, however, views of Colorado made in the second half of the 19th century which had a more artistic intent, where the aesthetics of the image was the primary focus, not the accuracy or information presented. In the post-war period, American artists began to search for ways to express in painting and drawings what was special about their country. The American West was a perfect subject for them, a land of sublime grandeur that was uniquely American. Colorado, with its awe-inspiring Rockies, provided them with particularly fabulous material. This led to the production of a new group of printed landscape images which were intended to convey the transcendent splendor of the unspoiled American wilderness as revealed in Colorado. The first important artist to express this romantic view of Colorado was Albert Bierstadt. On a number of trips through the West beginning in 1858, Bierstadt was tremendously impressed with the Rocky Mountains, which provided him with the subject matter for his most famous paintings. Bierstadt passed through the Rockies in the nascent days of the great American expansion west, so he saw and absorbed the almost pristine frontier, for which the Rocky Peaks provided an emphatic exclamation. This print, entitled Storm in the Rocky Mountains, Mount Rosalie, is a scene in Colorado based on sketches Bierstadt made on a visit in 1863. The large peak in the center was named Mount Rosalie by Bierstadt after Rosalie Ludlow, who soon became his wife. In 1895, this mountain was renamed Mount Evans in honor of Governor John Evans. This impressive print is a chromolithograph, where each color was printed from a separate lithographic stone. The print was produced in 1869 along with another chromo of Bierstadt's The Rocky Mountains Landers Peak, and the pair were hailed as, quote, unquestionably the finest examples of chromolithographic art. The quality and size of this print and Bierstadt's artistic skill had a large impact on the public perception of the West, helping to establish a new romantic image of Colorado and the Rocky Mountains. Shortly after Bierstadt's print was produced in 1872-73, a publication appeared entitled Picturesque America, which has been called the most magnificent illustrated work ever published in America. This book celebrated the variety and majesty of the maturing country through prose and many illustrations. Its prints were based on first-hand renderings from artists who traveled around the country for the project, and they are all designed to show the picturesque aspect of our nation, including Colorado. Worthington Whitridge was a well-known landscape artist in the Midwest who traveled to the American West with General John Pope's expedition of 1866. About 1870, he produced a painting, Crossing the Ford, Platte River, Colorado, based on sketches he made during the trip. It shows the ford across the Platte, basically at Denver. This is perhaps his best-known painting, and it was reproduced as a steel engraving in Picturesque America. It was one of the most widely disseminated pictures of Colorado, and it remains iconic to this day. One of the most famous artists to produce work for Picturesque America was Thomas Moran, who provided 40 sketches for the book, including a number of scenes of Colorado done as wood engravings. Now, Moran traveled all around the West many times over the years, and he produced paintings and watercolors capturing the romantic notion of the region. In 1876, Boston publisher Louis Prang issued a portfolio of 15 chromolithographs of Moran's watercolors, producing some of the best and most desirable Western prints of the 19th century. While most of the prints in the portfolio are of Yellowstone, 2 show scenes in Colorado. The one on the right of the Mountain of the Holy Cross, and the other one of the Mosquito Trail east of Leadville. Now, Moran's paintings of the West remained popular throughout the 19th century, and in 1888 he produced this etching of his picture of the Mountains of the Holy Cross, reinforcing an idealized image of Colorado in the minds of many Americans. While the romantic images of Colorado were popular in post-Civil War America, especially in the East, many of the citizens of Colorado were not as interested in prints depicting their state as an idealized American Eden as they were of views showing it as a land of opportunity. For the most part, they didn't want to see grandiose scenes of artistic merit, but rather views that would promote their local communities. The archetypical print of this sort is the bird's eye view, which became the dominant form of American urban view beginning in the 1870s. Artists would travel to different cities around the country trying to convince the local population to buy a subscription to propose bird's eye view. The sales pitch emphasized that each building and business in the community would be clearly illustrated and that the planned print would help promote the local economy. Another argument used was to point out that the community just down the road had been supported enough that a view was made of their town, and you certainly didn't want to come in second to them. And there are actually advertisements in newspapers where the artists would actually say this: you better come and subscribe because, boy, they did it and you guys don't want to be left out. Now, besides their inherent visual appeal, these views provide us an amazing resource to learn about American cities in the past. The prints had to be accurate, for they were primarily sold to locals, and if your house or business was not shown or was shown incorrectly, then you would badmouth the print and sales would dry up. The first true bird's eye views of Colorado appeared in 1873, one of which is this view of Golden. The view shows the city with the streets neatly laid out and each building clearly identifiable. As these prints were used for promotion of the town, factories are illustrated with billowing smokestacks while train lines demonstrate how the town was connected to the wider world. To further enhance the appeal of the town, a list of local establishments is included, listing 6 churches and a number of mills and other businesses. Now, this print is by D.D. Morse, one of the early makers of American bird's eye views. Morse started working on views of the Midwest in 1870, but by 1873 he branched out to other parts of the country. This view was printed by the Strobridge Lithography Company of Cincinnati, and that firm published a number of other Colorado bird's eye views in 1873-74. Those, though, were done by another artist, E.S. Glover. Eli Sheldon Glover began his work with bird's eye views in 1866, acting as a subscription agent for Midwestern printmaker Albert Ruger. By 1870, Glover had started his own business as an artist and publisher of city views. Unfortunately, in 1871, Chicago fire destroyed his presses, so he had to become a traveling artist for bird's eye views, eventually drawing over 60 different cities. In 1873, Glover came to Colorado, where he produced this view of Central City and Black Hawk. Like the Morse view, this image shows the towns as prosperous, with numerous active mills and other businesses depicted, and churches, hotels, etc. listed at the bottom. Now, one thing we see on this view, which became common in the future, was the illustrations in insets along the bottom of a number of local businesses. Now, this was very much in line with the advertising images on the regional maps we saw earlier, and it was a good source of additional income for the bird's eye view makers. The view of Central City and Black Hawk was but the first of 6 views made of Colorado by Glover. In 1874, Glover worked exclusively in Colorado, even operating a hotel in Colorado Springs that spring and summer. While Glover was successful enough to hang around in Colorado for the year, by 1875 he had moved on to Montana. Though Glover continued to produce bird's eye views throughout the 1870s, he did no more of Colorado. This indicates that he might not have been that successful, a supposition supported by the great scarcity of his views. For instance, the view of Boulder, which is in the top left corner and also is in the exhibit, that is the only copy I know of that print. It's not, there's a standard book by a man named John Reps of American Urban Views, and it doesn't list it. It was unknown to him, and that's the only copy. And that's the typical how some of these things are very rare, and it's possible other city views will turn up at some point. The Morse and Glover prints were the first bird's eye views of Colorado, but many more followed, with over 40 such prints issued in the 19th century. Many of those were done by one of the most successful bird's eye publishers, Joseph J. Stoner of Madison, Wisconsin. Interestingly, Stoner got his start the same way Eli Glover did, working as a subscription agent for Albert Ruger in 1868. After a year, Stoner became Ruger's partner, and then in 1872 he set up on his own, in the end producing over 300 bird's eye views around the country. In 1882, Stoner sent artist Henry Welg out west with the intent of making views of Colorado. 1882 was a time when the silver boom was roaring, so many of the communities in Colorado were experiencing considerable growth and hoping for more. This made the state a natural place for the sale of bird's eye views. Stoner's plan was a great success, resulting in the production of 14 bird's eye views of Colorado cities in 1882, ranging from Leadville, one of the richest cities in the country at the time and home to 16,000 residents, to Salida, founded only 6 years before and with a population of only 1,500. The silver boom, or more precisely its collapse, played a role in another Colorado bird's eye view, this image of Aspen from 1893. Founded in 1879 as a silver mining town, by the beginning of the last decade of the century, Aspen had 12,000 residents, 6 newspapers, many fine private homes, hotels, taverns, schools, churches, and a theater and opera house. In 1893, the Aspen Times partnered with another bird's eye maker, Augustus Koch, who had previously worked with J.J. Stoner, to create this detailed view of the city. Ironically, it was that year that the government stopped basing U.S. currency on silver, resulting in the collapse of silver prices and the almost total destruction of the silver industry in Colorado. In Aspen, as elsewhere in Colorado, mines shut down and many other businesses soon followed. Almost as soon as the ink was dry on this print, the market for such a thing disappeared, with potential buyers no longer so prosperous nor as interested. This left the Aspen Times with a large pile of unsold prints. A number of years later, in 1899, a snowstorm shut down access to outside supplies in Aspen, so the Times had to print the newspaper on the back of this pile of unsold Aspen prints. And there are a few examples of that that still turn up from time to time. Kind of an interesting story. Don't know what happened to the rest of the pile, though. I'd love to find those. This is a very late example of a classic bird's eye view, showing Cripple Creek and its sister town of Victor. Cripple Creek, a town of under 500 citizens before gold was discovered there in 1890, had a population of 19,000 when this print was produced. Early in 1896, the year this print was made, a couple of massive fires devastated the city, but there was still plenty of money available from the mines, so the city was rebuilt in brick later in the year. The pride of the citizens and their desire to boost its prospects going forward inspired the publication of this print, with the images of the two towns surrounded by vignettes of the many local mines. And if you look at this print, you'll see how much of it is built in brick. And that was the result of that fire. By the end of the 19th century, bird's eye views of urban centers in the classic sense started to disappear. But publishers still realized the great marketability of these images. While straightforward city views began to become rarer, the use of bird's eye views for advertisements became fairly common. This print looks like a fairly typical bird's eye view, but the title quoting the only 50-minute ride on the Union Pacific line from Denver gives us a clue that this was a view specifically designed to market Boulder as both a destination and a place to live. This is confirmed by example of the print at the Boulder Public Library, which shows the print in its original format as a newspaper insert. Published by the Boulder Camera, the print includes various business advertisements around the side and also promotes Boulder as the, quote, residence city of the West. The example in the CU library, which is out in the exhibit, shows that this print lived a second life as a decorative view, though one still promoting the Union Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific again used a bird's eye view to promote its business a few years later. Here showing their extensive railroad network from the Missouri River to Denver and on into the mountains. The image is from a much higher vantage point than the urban views we've seen so far, so the information on the towns and cities is pretty much limited to names. However, the colorful depiction of the mountains, rivers, and valleys still provides an interesting view of Colorado at the time. The Rocky Mountain National Park was established in 1915, and this colorful image by Ralph C. Prather was published a few years later as a promotional print for the park in the nearby community of Estes Park. It is a nice example of how this type of print had changed its purpose in the last half-century. The early bird's eye views aimed at accuracy and detail, illustrating particular businesses and buildings. But by 1922, the intent of this view was very different. The print was designed as, quote, a helpful guide and beautiful souvenir, Accuracy was not the focus, for as Prather writes in the bottom right corner, quote, although this view is to all intents and purposes a bird's eye, yet I have in all instances, as much as possible, endeavored to represent the park as seen and remembered by the average motorist and hiker. Prather goes on to say that he disregarded many of the rules of perspective, not wanting the print to be, quote, a flattened, stiff, mechanically correct plat. By the 20th century, there were lots of ways people could get accurate and detailed images of their communities. So hand-drawn prints like Prather's were used for purposes that went beyond the mechanically correct, in this case showing Colorado as it was seen and remembered by the average motorist and hiker. Over the century, from 1820 to 1920, the purpose of printed images of Colorado's changed considerably. The first prints of Colorado from the government reports were issued because little was known about the territory and the views provided valuable information. Beginning with Pikes Peak Gold Rush, the American people wanted to get a sense of what this new American frontier was like, a role filled nicely by the popular press. As the population in Colorado grew, the focus turned to economic development, resulting in promotional views and then outright advertising. Finally, printed views were produced to be helpful guides and beautiful souvenirs. The purpose for which these prints were issued are no longer relevant to us today, but the prints retain their significance. First off, they provide us with a privileged look at Colorado in days gone by. However, they not only give us pictures of what Colorado looked like, but they show us how Americans at the time saw Colorado, reflecting their understanding, interests, and desires. This is why I've tried to show not only what the views depict, but why and how the prints were made and marketed, hopefully giving us a deeper understanding of our past. I think we do have time. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. That would usually, the question is how they were sold by subscription. Usually what would happen is the artist would come into town and they would do drawings. And the drawings, they would go to the newspaper, almost always go to the newspaper first, and they would say, I've got these drawings, I want to do a print. The newspaper, which wanted to promote the town, would tell people, okay, this artist is in town, come down to the newspaper or go to this other shop, look at his prints. If you think they're good, you sign up. And if enough people signed up and you gave money, then the artist would go ahead. And there are instances, I didn't find any of Colorado, but there are instances where artists would go into a town. I mean, they went all, the bird's eye view makers especially would go all around the country. And there are instances where they go into town and not enough people signed up, so they didn't do it. But basically, it was pre-selling. And that's why, for instance, that map that came out in 1862, the second one, the one of which there's a variant copy out there, they were actually selling subscriptions. There's a report that he was selling subscriptions in December 1860. The map didn't come out to 1862. Likely one of the reasons was he didn't get enough subscriptions. And so that would delay it. But it was a way that they got money before that they would actually do it. Also, you could do it by going to a mill owner or something like that and saying, I'll do one of your mill, which you can use for advertisements, you know, if you pay me.
Bird's eye views are rather fascinating. When you consider you didn't have a bird's eye or an airplane.
Well, actually, that's an interesting subject and one I cut out. This talk was originally an hour and 15 minutes, so you're really lucky. But one of the issues on the bird's eye view, the idea was the way they did it. The first one that you saw of Glover, of Morse that did Golden, that was actually taken from Table Rock. And it says on it that it was from perspective. And the earliest ones were oftentimes done by that. But they developed a standard way that they would go around street by street drawing the buildings. And they had set up a standard method, mathematical method, of taking those views and changing them at an angle. And so they were done actually by this standard process.
Geometry.
Geometry, exactly. So there were no balloons. They didn't do balloons. Some of the earliest ones in the 70s, they do mention they are taken from a high point. But as you get on later, like for instance, there's a bunch of bird's eye views at Denver, and there's no place above Denver that you can get a view like that. Any other questions?
When did you develop your love of
I loved maps ever since I was a little kid, and I love maps of every sort. And I only learned when I went to school in England that you could actually own them. You could actually, you know, touch them, that they weren't just in books. And I think maps, I mean, they give you a look at the past. They're part of history. They were used by people. I think maps are fabulous. And they have some great maps in the library here.
Any other questions? Okay, well, don't forget to go across the hall to our library and check out the display over there. A lot of what Chris spoke about tonight is displayed next door across the way. Thank you all. Thank you, Chris.